From the earliest stages of human history, before the dawn of organized religion or structured science, the line between magic, medicine, and ritual was blurred. And among the most striking examples of this overlap is the ancient practice of cannibalistic remedies, the use of human flesh, bones, blood, or other remains as therapeutic substances. This phenomenon, shocking by modern sensibilities, had its roots in the deep prehistoric past, where early humans believed that consuming or applying parts of another person's body could transfer vitality, strength, or spiritual essence. And archaeological evidence from Paleolithic burial sites suggests not only ritual cannibalism, connected to survival, but also the possibility that bones or ashes of the deceased were ingested in funerary rites as a way of incorporating the spirit of the dead into the living community, an act that carried healing, protective, and even magical significance. In Mesopotamia, one of the cradles of civilization, clay tablets with early medical incantations mention human body fluids such as blood and bile as carriers of both disease and remedy, which indicates that the human body itself was seen as a storehouse of supernatural power. While in ancient Egypt, a culture famous for its elaborate burial rituals, corpses were preserved not just for the afterlife, but also paradoxically consumed in medicinal contexts centuries later, as fragments of embalmed flesh and powdered mummy became sought-after curatives for epilepsy, migraines, and internal bleeding. In early China, Taoist alchemical traditions emphasized the circulation of life energies, QI, and immortality practices occasionally included the ingestion of dried blood or ground bone, reflecting a belief that human vitality could be absorbed through consumption. And in tribal societies across Africa and the Americas, shamans or healers often prescribed ritualized forms of anthropophagy, where consuming a small portion of an enemy, ancestor, or sacrificial victim was thought to confer bravery, fertility, or resistance to illness, though such acts were not necessarily interpreted as cannibalism in the modern sense, but rather as sacred medicine. This worldview, that the human body contained powerful medicinal essences, was reinforced by universal beliefs about sympathy and correspondence, where like was thought to cure like, so drinking blood was believed to heal blood disorders, applying fat could soothe wounds, and ingesting bones could strengthen one's own skeletal system. Ideas that later became foundational to the theory of signatures in herbal medicine. The earliest written references to therapeutic cannibalism in Europe can be found in classical Greek sources, where the philosopher Empedocles alluded to the magical use of human remains, and later writers like Pliny the Elder described barbarian tribes consuming the blood of fallen warriors as a treatment for epilepsy, practices that Roman society at once condemned as savage, yet paradoxically tolerated when performed in controlled contexts, such as the sale of gladiator blood outside the arenas. What we see in this formative stage of history is not a bizarre anomaly, but rather a widespread conviction across continents that the human body was the most potent of all pharmacies, a sacred vessel of curative energies whose parts could be harvested and redistributed for health. And this cultural logic laid the groundwork for the much more systematic and medicalized cannibalistic practices that would dominate Europe and parts of the Middle East during the medieval and early modern eras, where the line between superstition, pharmacology, and ritual was often indistinguishable. And although modern science views such remedies with revulsion, their origins remind us that ancient people did not consume human matter out of barbarity alone, but from a sincere and structured belief in the healing essence of life itself. As human societies developed more structured systems of medicine, particularly in the classical world of Greece and Rome, and later in the Christian kingdoms of medieval Europe, the once loosely spiritual or tribal notion of cannibalistic remedies became increasingly codified, systematized, and even commercialized. And while ancient authors such as Galen and Dioscorides focused largely on plant-based or mineral-based therapies, traces of medicinal cannibalism lingered in their works, with occasional references to human marrow, blood, and menstrual fluid as potent agents of cure, a legacy that continued into the Roman Empire, where the most famous practice was the consumption of gladiator blood, collected from the bodies of the freshly killed or wounded combatants in the arenas, and sold to epileptics who believed that the vigor, vitality, and violent energy of the slain fighter could extinguish their seizures. a belief rooted in the logic of sympathetic magic that the strong blood of a warrior could calm the disordered blood of the afflicted. This gruesome commerce was well documented by contemporary observers such as Pliny the Elder and Celsus, who noted the paradox of a refined empire partaking in what was otherwise dismissed as barbarian custom. Yet it reflected a cultural consensus that life force resided in blood and could be transferred. Moving into the medieval period, especially after the fall of Rome, Christian Europe inherited these traditions and blended them with religious symbolism, where the sacramental act of consuming the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist resonated symbolically with the idea of gaining healing through human flesh. And while theologians distinguished sacrament from superstition, the overlap made the medical use of corpses less alien. During the Middle Ages, the most widespread cannibalistic medicine was the use of powdered skulls, bones, and sometimes dried flesh, remedies thought to treat epilepsy, headaches, bleeding disorders, and even plague. And it was believed that the skull of a young man, preferably executed violently, contained the strongest healing spirit. So apothecaries ground human bone into fine powder to be mixed with wine or herbs, prescribing it as a legitimate pharmacological product sold in markets from London to Prague. Another important medieval remedy was mumia, which originally referred to the natural bituminous substances found in Middle Eastern caves and mines, but gradually came to mean the powdered remains of embalmed Egyptian mummies imported through trade routes. And because the embalming resins and flesh were thought to contain both preservative and curative energies, European physicians enthusiastically recommended mummy powder for internal bleeding, bruises, and consumption, leading to a booming trade where actual mummified corpses were robbed from Egyptian tombs and shipped to Europe to satisfy pharmaceutical demand. Executions and battlefields also became important suppliers of medicinal bodies, for it was believed that the freshly killed carried the most potent vitality. So spectators at hangings often collected drops of blood from the condemned to drink immediately, a practice especially common in Germany and Scandinavia, where epilepsy sufferers rushed to cup their hands beneath the gallows, convinced that warm living blood could calm their convulsions. Fat, too, entered the pharmacopoeia, for human fat taken from corpses was rendered into salves used for arthritis, joint pain and wounds, and executioners themselves became unlikely medical practitioners, selling fat, bones, and blood from the criminals they dispatched, sometimes even preparing ointments on demand. Across medieval Europe, this traffic in human remains was not fringe quackery, but part of mainstream medicine, endorsed by learned physicians and codified in pharmacological texts. Though not without critics, some clerics denounced the practice as sacrilege, some scholars doubted its efficacy, and yet the deep hunger for cures, combined with the philosophical belief that the human body mirrored nature's medicines, ensured its persistence. What is striking is how normalized these remedies became in an age otherwise obsessed with religious purity, and how commerce, ritual, and medicine converged around the human corpse as a resource, a phenomenon that reveals both the desperation of societies plagued by chronic illness and epidemics, and the enduring belief that health could be stolen or borrowed from another body, even if that body was dead, criminal, or foreign, making cannibalistic medicine not a relic of savagery, but a cornerstone of medieval pharmacology that bridged antiquity with the coming boom of early modern science. By the 16th century, the practice of cannibalistic medicine entered what might be called its golden age. For in the climate of Renaissance curiosity, exploration, and the birth of modern science, the consumption of human remains was not only tolerated, but celebrated by many of Europe's most respected physicians, philosophers, and apothecaries, who attempted to strip the practice of its older magical connotations and reframe it as a rational, chemical, and medical procedure. And this shift was epitomized by figures like the Swiss physician-alchemist Paracelsus, who argued that life itself was a kind of alchemical essence that could be extracted, concentrated and transferred with human blood, flesh, and fat serving as particularly rich repositories of this vital spirit, a view that gave intellectual respectability to practices that might otherwise have been dismissed as grotesque superstition. At the same time, European apothecaries stocked their shelves with mumia, powdered mummy imported from Egypt, powdered skulls, bones, and jars of rendered human fat, which were prescribed to patients of all social classes, From peasants to kings, and often mixed with herbs, wine, or spirits to mask their flavor, though some remedies required fresh material, particularly blood, which was believed to lose its power quickly once separated from the body, leading to the notorious practice of collecting blood directly from executed criminals, sometimes offered warm in cups to epileptics standing at the scaffold, and in other cases dried and powdered for use in later treatments. William Harvey, discoverer of the circulation of the blood, and other early modern scientists did not shy away from such remedies, and even though they laid the foundations of modern physiology, they nonetheless acknowledged the curative potency of human matter, a paradox that reveals how entrenched cannibalistic medicine was in both learned and popular practice. One of the most prized remedies of this period was powdered skull, particularly that of a young man who had died violently, because it was thought that sudden death preserved the vitality of the spirit within the bones, making it especially powerful against epilepsy and head-related ailments. While human fat, known in Latin as axungia hominis, was applied externally in salves to treat bruises, arthritis and wounds, sometimes even combined with moss that grew on skulls, which was thought to absorb the essence of the dead. Beyond Europe, the practice also intersected with global trade, for the conquest of the New World brought Europeans into contact with indigenous peoples who practiced ritual cannibalism for religious or martial reasons. And while Europeans often condemned these practices as barbaric, they paradoxically defended their own medicinal cannibalism as civilized science. And indeed, demand for Egyptian mummies surged in this era, with merchants looting tombs and selling dried corpses by the shipload, so much so that fake mummies were manufactured by drying the bodies of executed criminals and selling them as ancient relics to European buyers. Royalty and nobility eagerly participated in these treatments, with King Francis V of France reported to have regularly ingested powdered mummy for strength. And even well into the 17th century, English and German physicians recommended corpse-derived medicines in official pharmacopoeias, meaning that cannibalism was not marginal, but mainstream. This widespread acceptance did not, however, go unchallenged, for moral and religious critics questioned the ethics of consuming human flesh, some warning that it verged on blasphemy or sacrilege, while skeptics doubted its effectiveness. And yet the authority of learned men and the desperation of sufferers, especially in an age of plagues, epilepsy and chronic illness, ensured its survival. Executioners, often despised in daily life, became important suppliers of medicine, selling fat, bones, and blood from the criminals they dispatched, sometimes even advertising their goods at markets, a trade both tolerated and regulated in some cities, while battlefield surgeons occasionally harvested fat and bone from fallen soldiers to prepare ointments for the living, illustrating how normalized the practice had become in Europe's culture of death. The intellectual climate of the scientific revolution, far from extinguishing these practices, initially reinforced them, as natural philosophers sought to classify and analyze the powers of human matter, with some experimenting on how long blood retained its vital heat, or whether distilled human bone could cure paralysis, experiments that reveal an early scientific curiosity wrapped in gruesome procedures. Yet by the 18th century, cracks began to appear in the edifice of cannibalistic medicine, as Enlightenment rationalism, advances in chemistry, and a growing sense of human dignity led some physicians to denounce corpse medicine as a relic of barbarism, while at the same time alternatives in plant and mineral pharmacology offered safer and less revolting cures, though even then, the practice did not vanish overnight, lingering in folk traditions and in some official prescriptions well into the century, which shows that cannibalistic medicine had become so deeply rooted in the European imagination that only the combined forces of science, ethics, and cultural change could slowly erode it. Nevertheless, the early modern boom stands as the period when cannibalistic remedies reached their widest acceptance and most systematic application, a strange convergence of alchemy, medicine, commerce, and ritual that reveals the paradox of Renaissance and Enlightenment Europe, an age celebrated for reason and progress, yet steeped in practices that today evoke horror, but which in their time embodied the desperate human quest for health, longevity, and mastery over death itself. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the once dominant practice of cannibalistic medicine, the ingestion and application of human remains as therapeutic remedies, entered a slow but irreversible decline, a process shaped by the twin forces of Enlightenment rationalism and the emerging ethos of human dignity. For while corpse medicine had been defended for centuries by some of the most respected physicians of Europe, the intellectual climate began to shift as scientific chemistry replaced alchemical speculation, and the symbolic logic of like cures like gave way to laboratory testing and empiricism. And with this change, the very foundation of cannibalistic remedies, their reliance on mystical vital essences trapped within blood, bones or fat, came under increasing scrutiny. Critics argued that there was no measurable evidence that powdered skulls or mummy flesh cured epilepsy or bleeding, while moralists condemned the practice as hypocritical, especially in societies that simultaneously denounced New World ritual cannibalism as barbarism, a contradiction not lost on Enlightenment thinkers who ridiculed the inconsistency of a Europe that devoured corpses in the name of medicine while branding other cultures as savage. And in this climate, the reputation of corpse medicine began to sour, even though in practice it lingered for surprisingly long, with English pharmacopoeias still listing skull and mummy into the early 18th century, and folk healers across Germany, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe continuing to prescribe human fat salves and blood remedies well into the 19th century. Evidence of the stubborn persistence of tradition in the face of scientific reform. The decline was also hastened by the availability of alternatives. For as botany, chemistry, and anatomy advanced, physicians discovered plant-derived analgesics, mineral-based tonics, and eventually laboratory-created medicines that could rival or surpass the supposed powers of corpse material without the moral stain. While improvements in medical institutions and the growing professionalization of doctors distanced official medicine from the trades of executioners and grave robbers who had long supplied the raw material. Nonetheless, the cultural memory of cannibalistic medicine left its mark on both science and imagination, for in some ways it prefigured modern medical breakthroughs such as blood transfusion, organ transplantation, and tissue therapy. Practices that also revolve around the idea that one person's body can heal another, though today framed in ethical and scientific terms rather than magical or alchemical ones, showing that while the symbolism of corpse medicine was abandoned, its underlying logic of vitality transfer did not vanish but rather transformed into more humane and rational forms. Literature and philosophy of the 19th century also reflected on the legacy of corpse medicine, with romantic writers drawing upon the eerie image of powdered mummy or gallows blood to critique both the horrors of superstition and the contradictions of Enlightenment science, while Gothic fiction turned the theme into motifs of horror, echoing society's ambivalence toward its own medical past. In some folk traditions, especially in rural Europe, the use of skull moss, blood, or human bone lingered into the 20th century, whispered of in the practices of cunning folk and village healers, though by then considered superstition rather than legitimate medicine. Meanwhile, anthropologists and historians in the Victorian era looked back on corpse medicine as both a curiosity and a stain on Europe's self-image, for it forced them to admit that the so-called civilized West had itself participated in cannibalistic practices for centuries, undermining colonialist narratives of superiority. In the broader history of medicine, the decline of cannibalistic remedies represents not just the end of a gruesome chapter, but also the birth of modern medical ethics. For the rejection of corpse medicine coincided with growing concerns about consent, the sanctity of the human body, and the distinction between healing and exploitation, values that became foundational in the later development of medical codes and patient rights. Yet even today, the specter of corpse medicine lingers in cultural memory, for the fascination with consuming or absorbing human vitality reappears in popular myths, horror stories, and pseudoscientific health fads, reminders that the ancient desire to heal by taking in the essence of others has not entirely disappeared, but merely changed form. And when modern society debates issues such as stem cell research, blood banking, or organ markets, echoes of the same ethical questions raised by cannibalistic medicine about where we draw the line between life-saving practice and exploitation of the human body resonate powerfully. Thus, the decline of corpse medicine was not merely a matter of science triumphing over superstition, but a broader transformation in how humanity conceived of itself. moving from a world where the dead were pharmaceutically consumed as objects to one where human remains became symbols of dignity and inviolability. And yet beneath this shift lies an enduring truth. The cannibalistic remedies of the past, however grotesque to modern sensibilities, were born of the same impulse that drives medicine today: the relentless human quest to conquer suffering and death, to wrest life from decay, and to find in the body, whether one's own or another's, the secret key to survival.